Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Darren Daly, and I'm an epidemiologist and an applied statistician. I work at the University College Cork. I want to welcome you on behalf of my co-presenters to our session, the ominously named Rise of Stats Twitter, the Risks and Rewards of Social Media Use. Before I get into the talk, the initial talk, I just want to say that tomorrow there's going to be another session that's really going to get into the nuts and bolts of how to use Twitter, kind of more of a tutorial. So today is really talking more about kind of other issues around social media use, issues that affect us as statisticians and researchers. And I have to say, I've been asked to give this talk a few times now over the past several years. And it's a really embarrassing thing, one, to be asked to talk about, and two, to actually get up and do, much like how online dating used to be. If you remember, like I was in grad school in the early 2000s, and I can actually raise my hand. I can admit that I logged on to eHarmony, and I filled out a profile, and I was terrified to do such a thing, and terrified someone would find out that I was doing online dating. I then got married and had kids and all the rest of it, and lo and behold, I learned that apparently people today, it's all they do is online dating. And I feel like this is quite analogous to Twitter. So when I used to be asked to do Twitter stuff, it was like, oh, no, I'd really like people to ask me to come talk about statistics or research or useful things. But then over time, I've come to accept the fact that Twitter is a really powerful tool if you know how to use it, if you know how to get engaged and get involved. It's even a little bit worse to come in and talk to statisticians about Twitter in some respects, because I view statisticians kind of like Yoda here. We're cautious, we're careful. We don't rush in to judge. We use information, we learn from data, and so on. And most importantly, I think statisticians, more than kind of anyone else in science, wield, the one truth, big quotation marks. The real kind of underpinning of how science works is statistical and causal inference. And when you first think of Twitter, it's anything but serious and cautious and well thought out sometimes. It's full of absolute nonsense. And I can't stand up here and talk to you today about Twitter and not acknowledge that Twitter is full of all kinds of trivial garbage that most of us, maybe we care about, and there's nothing wrong with that, but maybe we shouldn't. And certainly a lot of misinformation, which is what we'll come back to in a little bit. So Twitter, at the end of the day, is this remarkable cesspool. And if you go out and you Google Twitter is a cesspool, you will find no shortage of opinions from people all across the political spectrum and everything else confirming that that is true. Twitter is a terrible cesspool, and it is. But something kind of interesting has happened with Twitter, and that is that it's become this amazing place. And I don't say that lightly. I feel weird to sit here and say it's a cesspool, but this amazing thing has come out of it. It's now experts have learned that they can find each other online using Twitter and other social media, and we can communicate with each other directly. And this has had an enormous number of advantages for the people who use the platform and other social media, advantages of our participation for others. And so really that's what this session is going to be about today. We're going to do 3 different talks back to back. We'll hold questions until the very end, and then we'll have 4 panelists come to the front and take whatever questions we have time for at the end. So the point of the talk now is to kind of stimulate your thinking, stimulate your questions so we can have a discussion. When we first kind of pitched this particular talk, we thought that it would be, maybe 20 people. We'd get a little small room. We'd all hold hands at the end and sing Kumbaya and talk about our feelings and how we feel about things. Then we were told we were in the big room, and we're very excited for that opportunity as well. So we might have everybody come down to the front later on. We'll see. You're not going to do that, so forget I even said it. So anyway, the three big take-home messages today are going to be, one is I'm going to try to convince you that Twitter and use of social media is in and of itself useful for you as a statistician. And I'm not a social media guru, I'm an applied statistician. I'm not here to talk about maximizing your impact. I'm not talking about the ref, I'm not talking about any of that kind of stuff. I'm talking about how it can actually benefit you in your day-to-day job and maybe beyond. To talk about how other people can benefit from your participation as statisticians. We have an expertise that is deeply, deeply lacking and is needed. And so there's other ways that we can contribute to social media to help out And then finally, what we want to not glaze over, we want to be very clear about, is that both the benefits and risks of social media use are not shared proportionally across all users. Right? So we want to make sure that we highlight these issues and talk about how we can deal with them. So the first kind of benefit is the most obvious one when people log into Twitter, and essentially it is content discovery. And so I woke up this morning, and one of the first things I saw was an article now in the New Yorker from Hannah Fry talking about the kind of limits of statistics. And she's talking about David Spiegelhalter and kind of Quillette and all the rest of it. So that's kind of, you wake up and you kind of see the people that you're following and that follow you are sharing things that are by definition of interest to you, or else you wouldn't follow them. So finding new content is an incredibly useful thing, and a thing that I think most people who engage with Twitter in a somewhat passive way kind of stop at this point. That they're going to they're going to get on Twitter, they're going to see things come through their feed that are going to be useful for them, they're going to find things they would have never found before. And that's a great use of the platform. I wasn't able to get in town. I had problems with the rental car, so I missed the keynote. But here Sarah's live tweeting as we go, so I can kind of check out the slides. I can kind of see the overall theme of everything. It's just a way for us to share. It's like having an instant messenger in your pocket with every scientist that you'd like to talk to, chiming in. And so you can really keep track of what's going on and not miss out on things. And one thing just to say, when we call it Stats Twitter, it doesn't exactly mean statisticians Twitter. It really means people who use statistics Twitter. And then there's a wide variety of other kind of communities, to loosely use the term. So we have Epi Twitter, Med Ed, the doctors like to get on there and do little tutorials about things. I find that very interesting as a clinical researcher. The economists are there. Certainly our users are there in force, data visualization and so on. So there's lots of ways to kind of quickly plug into lots of different types of communities. But things really start to take off when we start interacting with each other. And you're supposed to laugh at this. This is actually Sander Greenland and actually Frank Harrell snippeting each other on Twitter for all the world to see. Can't argue with Sander, last word, Greenland. I take an enormous amount of pleasure out of these conversations, for one, because to see the humanity in these people whose papers I read and everything else, but also the fact that they're on the platform discussing statistics in an outward and open way that the rest of us can all either participate in or observe, I find very, very enlightening and useful. And so when I first got on to Twitter, there weren't that many statisticians and epidemiologists on 10 years ago. There was a good handful, and actually, these were the first people I followed, which is 3 or 4 basically RSS accounts and my wife and my best man. One of those people is not like the others. David doesn't follow me on Twitter. Is David here by any chance? No? All right. Don't tell him I said that. I'd be embarrassed. But over the years, it's really become much more involved in terms of kind of the senior echelon people. And at this point, I think a lot of very serious and very well-known statisticians use the platform to varying degrees. And I would give a kind of special acknowledgement here to Andy Grieve, who I think he really gets involved in a lot of discussions. He's not scared to kind of get in the muck with the rest of us and throw his elbows around. And by throw his elbows around, I mean send you links to really good papers that you maybe never heard of before. But he's really engaging, and he's just great to talk to online. Another way we can do this is you can use Twitter to get help. And I've started shamelessly, when I'm looking for reviewers, I've started shamelessly taking advantage of Twitter to just ask. And usually when I'm trying to find reviewers for papers, it's beg and ask and Google and search and this and that. I can usually get on Twitter, I can usually say a few words, and then within a few hours often, I've got like 2 or 3 really good recommendations from people. And so here I've got Leslie McClure, who's the head of Stats and Epi at Drexel University in the States, and she sent me the names of actually 2 people who were very qualified reviewers, and actually one of them wound up agreeing to review. So that's a huge victory for me and a huge time saver to do that. And then we really start to get things going. We start to talk about collaboration and how we can identify those online by being connected to one another. And so this is an example about me and Maarten and Frank Harrell that obviously I really like. And there was this paper essentially about novel subgroups and in diabetes. And every time I see the word novel subgroup, I do a little bit of latent class analysis or mixture models, and I kind of know when I see subgroups I start to tingle a little bit, my senses start to get a little worried. And so we had to look at this paper, and it was using mixture models to identify these groups of people. And so Frank Harrell had written something about this, and he had blogged about it and shared that on Twitter. I had at the same time written something about it and shared my thoughts about that paper on Twitter. And then Maarten, who you'll hear from next, he joined in. And so the three of us then got in touch with each other, took the main points we were all making. We all wrote a letter to the editor that was then published in response to the paper. Not surprisingly, the authors of the original study weren't really interested in our opinions whatsoever, but we at least got it off of our chest. But maybe more importantly is that the blog and the letter got picked up by another diabetologist who then happened to have some data sitting around, which if they could address the question raised in the original paper, they could consider our critiques and then actually look at them. And lo and behold, when they did that, they actually found that the results from the other starts weren't really replicable, and probably for the reasons that we had pointed out. And so using Twitter to be able to find people that have these shared interests, it's not just, you're not limited to the people down the hall, the people at your university, but literally anyone in the world you can find and identify and work with. From that point, now I knew Maarten a little bit better, and we met in real life, and so that I knew he was an expert in prognostic modeling. I had been asked to support some researchers in Cork doing that kind of work. It was something I was familiar with, but I wanted a little bit of a backup, someone to tell me if I was just making sure I wasn't doing anything wrong, that cautious statistician thing. And so Maarten joined that particular paper as well as a collaborator. If we talk about other major collaborations that have happened, some of you will be very familiar with the recent redefined statistical significance paper. Do there happen to be any authors? It had like 92 authors. Any authors in the audience? Nobody will admit to it. So that paper came out. That was largely driven by people at first talking on Twitter about what to do and then getting together and collaboratively writing that paper. And like Twitter works sometimes, it gives us a great opportunity then to respond to these things. And so here's Daniel Akins, who's a psychologist. He then saw this paper. He decided he had some critiques about it in classical Dutch fashion. He made those quite direct. And then he gathered a group of people, also using Twitter, to write essentially a response paper called Justify Your Alpha, which again, if you look at the authorship list for Justify Your Alpha, you'd recognize if you're on Twitter that the vast majority of the authors there are using Twitter to connect with one another. And again, that's kind of how that paper got the ball rolling. So all of this following from the ASA statement and everything else. A final example is that recently there was a group of surgeons from Harvard, and they decided that they would take a bunch of papers that were found, quote unquote, non-significant findings, and they declared at the end that there was a crisis of underpowered studies in surgery. And so a statistician, Andrew Gelman, he'd called them out on this idea that we could use this kind of post hoc power based on the observed effect size, that's nothing more than a transformation of the observed p-value. If you take a bunch of non-significant findings, then of course those things will be underpowered to detect the effect that you actually estimated. He wrote a letter to the editor. The surgeons said, we're not going to pay attention to that whatsoever. They then submitted a second paper to another surgical journal making the same point. And so at this point now, there are something like 39 different comments, probably 25 different statisticians, and a lot of names that you would recognize, using another kind of new tool in terms of social media, PubPeer, to make their comments known about the fallacy of this procedure and trying to correct the authors and what it means and doesn't mean with this idea of post hoc power. So again, this is just another example of people communicating, statisticians on Twitter, getting together, working together in order to kind of address some of these issues. And I have to say, it's a lot more satisfying than waiting for your letter to the editor to go in. You wait 6 months to hear something back. Maybe they publish it. Maybe their friend's an associate editor on the journal. You never know. Like, these things tend to often just disappear into the night. But now we can do this stuff openly and out where everybody can see it. All right, so that's kind of big picture stuff, I think. We also use Twitter a lot just to kind of share compliments. So this was me last year sitting in a room like this when we were in Cardiff and watching Peter Diggle talk, and I just thought it was the best talk I'd ever seen. Statistician talk about statistics and practice and everything else. I think he has a Twitter account, but it doesn't seem to be very active. So unfortunately, he didn't get this message from me. But we also get other kind of nice feedback. So I had written a thing about the deficit of statistical thinking in science and beyond. and I posted it up on Medium as a blog. And I can't tell you like how satisfying it is. I don't get this kind of satisfaction when I write a scientific paper to have David Spiegelhalter say the words like, "This isn't junk. This was good. I enjoyed this." And I just don't see a lot of other areas kind of professionally where you get that kind of immediate gratification and everything else. Or when you write something online, you're trying to explain, a fairly, maybe what's a simple concept to us, but it certainly isn't to everyone, and you get feedback. This is a statistician who works at a private hospital in the States, and saying that he'd shared something I wrote with some of his colleagues, and they were saying this was useful, and so on and so forth. So that stuff, to get that stuff back through social media, I find very, very helpful. And of course, just simply celebrating the small victories, like a paper submitted, a paper accepted, a grant submitted, and so on. Just being able to share that with people, I think, is a nice thing. And we could use more nice things. Who couldn't? On the flip side of that, I like to use Twitter myself to do a bit of grumbling. And I have to admit, and we can talk about this in the discussion, it's maybe a bit too much grumbling for some people's taste. But we do like to get on there and have a nice old complaint about kind of poor statistical thinking, poor use of statistics, logistic regression being confused with artificial intelligence, people trying to sell personalized nutrition plans to optimize your health. Just sign up for our genomics kit and we'll tell you everything and unlock all the mysteries of the universe. We like to complain about that stuff, that's for sure. And also you kind of share the disheartening moments. A paper gets rejected, you don't get shortlisted for a grant and so on. And it's nice, for other people to come in and, hey, this happens to everybody, you know the deal, and so on and so forth. So I really like this kind of aspect of Twitter as well. People come in with a nice laugh from time to time. I found this hilarious anyway. I was trying to say something very noble about research and bias and how we should approach it and everything else. Basically this story that they had done all this work on these different supercomputers, and then once they had to bring them all together, and then Sarah coming in, so the algorithms had to wait months for the people to converge. That's hilarious. That's a very funny joke. I really appreciated that. And then another thing is like friendship. One, I'd like to see a TV show, I think, with Andy Grieve and Stevenson. I think that would be great. The frequentist and the Bayesian, kind of the, living together, something along those lines. But obviously their friendship extends way beyond Twitter, but I've been able to meet a lot of people through the use of Twitter, Maarten and Altea now, and Deirdre, and plenty of others. And for those of us, who aren't exactly the most, socially graceful people, for those of us that are a bit awkward, and we're statisticians, I'm not trying to stereotype statisticians, but you know what I mean. I think it's really comforting and nice to get to know some people online a little bit first, and then you show up for your conference and there's 2 or 3 people that you've already had some positive interactions with and everything else. And then if those people are, can, in some ways serve as kind of mentors and, people who are going to give you advice and things like that, then it's even better. And I've certainly benefited from a lot of that kind of stuff from using Twitter. People talk a lot about bubbles. We're in our echo chambers if you're using social media. You're in a Twitter bubble and you're not hearing alternative opinions. And I have my eyes kind of opened almost on a daily basis to the perspective of other people. And so this would be a great example from Kareem. I would have spent the first 10 years of my career stomping my feet saying, you need to fake it till you make it, and it's okay to not know things, and you need to put yourself out there and you need to say stuff. But, there are differences in how people react to that. And, there's a reality here where I can get on Twitter and I can just spout off opinions left, right, and center, and nobody challenges me on them whatsoever. So, of course, I think fake it till you make it is a good idea. But Kareem has had very different experiences. And so being able to be exposed to that is the very opposite of a Twitter bubble, to see these perspectives. And it also kind of opens up these kind of bigger picture issues that we weren't talking about as a community, 5 or 10 years ago. And so this is this very troubling story from Christian Lum 2 years ago about a situation where she was sexually assaulted and harassed. And that was the kind of stuff, that 10 years ago, there was Whisper Network and people communicated this stuff to each other, but now people are being able to share this information with each other, to talk about it out in the open, and so that people, when they engage in these bad behaviors, can actually be held accountable. And this is the kind of stuff I don't think we talk about this enough in our local environment necessarily, but people talk about these things all the time on Twitter, and I think it's incredibly helpful. finally, we kind of get into, we also have an opportunity to interact with non-statisticians. And so through Twitter, I got involved with a patient advocacy group, Melanoma Patient Network Europe. They've invited me multiple times to come and give talks to patients and patient advocates about statistics, so helping them to understand how to read the literature and so on. And that is, if people have done that kind of work before, it's remarkably gratifying to get up in front of that kind of an audience, that they're such engaged learners. And then they have a Facebook group that I participate in. I'm more of a lurker in that. I'm the only non-patient there. And of course, I learn a ton from the patients. They know an infinite amount of stuff about cancer treatments, about health technology assessments, and all the rest of it. So it's very much a two-way street. I've also been very fortunate. I've had Tamara Haspel, for example. She's an award-winning journalist in the Washington Post. She'll send me the occasional DM, like, what do you think about this? You know, does this make sense to you? And I'm always very happy. She writes very thoughtful, clever things about food science. And so I'm always very happy to contribute. And she's very appreciative of that. And so I think if you have yourself kind of out there a little bit where people can find you, these other types of experts will find you eventually and happily take advantage of your expertise. So with that, then we have a little bit on risks. So kind of we'll go from mild to severe. It's easy to be misunderstood on Twitter. So for those of you who are kind of on Twitter and lurking or maybe participating, there's this like ongoing debate between Stevenson and Judea Pearl about Lord's paradox, and they've got different perspectives. And you read the stuff and you think that they're just in these massively opposing camps and they're kind of going back and forth with each other. Again, it's really enjoyable to watch. So I made this joke that I got a year sabbatical to unpack these tweets, what it is essentially. But I didn't expect that anyone would take it seriously, and so then Judea Pearl is chiming in to give me his 2 cents on what I should do with this not real sabbatical whatsoever. And I actually got 2 emails from people at work, because if you want to irritate academics, tell them someone else besides them got a sabbatical. So people were like, I heard you got a sabbatical, and no, I was just joking on Twitter. There's this issue of FOMO, fearing missing out, and this is a problem with using Twitter, and speaking for me personally, like once you're kind of plugged in and you're engaging with people, you get to this point where you just don't want to miss anything. Like if you publish something and you share it, it's really hard to walk away from watching people comment on something you wrote. But it doesn't mean I don't have work to do that day. So you have to be kind of very judicious about your use and thoughtful at the beginning and try to set limits on things and turn off Twitter and have times and all the rest of it. I try to ignore, as an American who spent 6 years living in Leids and now 5 years in Cork, I feel like I'm getting it from both sides in terms of some of the more serious issues of the day. And you try to ignore that stuff as best you can, or maybe we shouldn't. But this kind of thing does become a distraction because every journalist on earth is on Twitter, every pundit is on Twitter, every political commentator. And so sometimes avoiding these important things but distractions can be challenging for sure. I love this. This is one of the best things. Arguing with people online, again, takes a little bit of discipline. I remember, again, in the early 2000s, I used to like to get on message boards and argue with people about, sports. Like who is the best sports team of all time and who is the best sports team of this week. And, that might have had something to do with the dating problems I was having, now that I think about it. But I learned then that there were these people, they were going to argue with you till you were blue in the face, and they were going to take and waste your time and all the rest of it. And you need to not give them the time of day and be very cautious about it. And I've also found myself, you really do kind of have this thing where you can misconstrue things, you can get kind of upset and legitimately angry with someone over an interaction online that wouldn't happen in the real world. And we have to be kind of conscious of these things. And I've had some embarrassing moments, where I've kind of gone after a journalist for what I thought was a misleading headline, and it turns out that person, of course they were, was an absolute expert in what they were talking about. It wasn't their fault, the headline. And I was really out of line and out of place for what I had said. And, it's really embarrassing to have those things happen. So, and it was obviously it wasn't a good experience for the journalist. Not that they really cared, but, it's not nice when people aren't nice to you. It's that simple. So, we have to be conscious of these things too. And then at the extreme end of this, we know that there's a lot of kind of toxic behavior, and it's certainly not disproportionately felt. And like I said before, I've been writing stuff now, for 10 years, some of it, not uncontroversial. And I can kind of list the number of times that someone has come after me on Twitter. It's probably like 5 or 6, where I've been called a not nice name or something like that. I've only received one email ever from someone, with unkind words for something I wrote. And, listening to my, other colleagues, female colleagues in particular, that this is not always their experience, and that there is a lot of grief. And this leads to a really important missing data problem when we start to talk about Twitter. You can get on the platform and you can kind of see who's engaging. And I think we can really see that some people, and we've had these talks before, people feel inhibited from contributing and fully kind of enjoying the benefits of Twitter, because for them it's just not worth the hassle of having to put up with some cretin giving them a hard time because they, said something. So we have to keep these things in mind as well. Just one quick thing to wrap up. We're not talking about Twitter, but there's, obviously lots of other social media. Blogs are a great one. This is lesslikely.com. It's written by Zad Chow. Really good stuff on history of statistics and other issues where he kind of does post-publication peer review of papers. I will say this, I do a bit of blogging, and now I just do all my stuff on Medium because it's easy. And to be able to write something and get a few thousand people to view it, I'm not trying to be a writer for the New York Times. I'm pretty convinced that when I get 2,000 people to read something of mine that starts with the word statistics in the title, that it's the right 2,000 people. And I don't really have another way that I can think of to get that kind of a reach, writing in journals, writing letters to editors, or what have you. So I think it's a really useful thing, and it really feeds back into Twitter. People who pick up a lot of Twitter followers, and there is value in that that's beyond just saying I have Twitter followers, it often is sped up substantially by people who produce content. So I've seen it, with my own stuff. Like, I produce content, I share it, and I get a rash of followers to follow, and then it just kind of ticks a little bit over time until I do the next thing. And we don't want to sleep on blog comments, particularly on Deborah Mayo's blog and Andrew Gelman's blog. A lot of the threads there go into 200 different comments from some of the world's best statisticians going back and forth about kind of the statistical issues of the day. And a lot of the stuff that wound up going into the ASA statement on p-values and the follow-up pieces, a lot of that stuff had its origins in the blogs and these comments. Frank Harrell started a message board called Data Methods, which is very quickly in a year's time turned into a wonderful resources of statisticians coming together, sharing tips, and now there's like this list of things that is, when you see this in a review, what are the references used to explain to the authors that this isn't the best plan? We now have people doing podcasts, and so we have people who are going on and explaining their work and everything else in different media now, live streams of how to do our things. It's endless now how we can share all this stuff. And so to kind of just wrap it up and move on to Maarten's talk, he's going to talk more about kind of the nuts and bolts of communicating properly on Twitter. I just want to say something that, along the lines of, I think that we have a real deficit, and I think most people in this room would agree. We have a real deficit in statistical thinking, not just in science, but in science and beyond. And we can see online, whether it's someone, some pseudoscientist publishing something, we see a lot of people using statistics or something that appears to be statistics to kind of, BS other people that don't know how to evaluate it. And whether that's pseudoscientists, whether that's actual scientists who don't understand the methods themselves, or what have you, people who are just trying to manipulate, I think there's a real role for statisticians to contribute their expertise to push back on some of that nonsense that other people simply aren't armed to recognize and deal with. So to that end, I'd like to encourage everyone to participate with the kind of caveats that we understand there are risks and that we have to find ways to overcome those. So thank you very much.
So I'm going to talk a bit about the nuts and bolts. But before I do, I want to say that I have some links to nice tweets, but you don't have to picture them. You can just go to my slide share and you can find the whole presentation. So why am I here? Well, actually, it's because Darren asked me something along the lines of, could you say a few words about the anatomy of successful tweets? And I said, sure, but I'm just a medical statistician with formal training in statistics and epidemiology. So I'm actually not a science communicator at all. But I do tweet fairly regularly, almost daily. I have 6,000 tweets, I think, in total. So actually this talk is more or less about tweeting architecture from somebody who's just a tweet construction worker. So that's my disclaimer. So this is my own most successful tweet. It's a joke. Well, people like this joke somehow because it's going to 1 million views, which is nice. But of course, there are many nice tweets to mention today. I'm just going to mention 4 here. This is a nice one by Frank Harrow, I think, that observational research is often so bad that correlation is not even correlation instead of causation. Laura has a very nice point, I think, about how people sometimes use data analytics and putting in a blender. It's a nice one, I think, very recently of Daniel Lakens, Dutch psychologist. I think it's a nice point he makes. And lastly, I want to highlight a recent tweet by Jack. So these are all nice, I think, personally, I think these are nice tweets. But they're very short, right? They're well, maximal 280 characters. And what if you have more to say? Well, then you use multiple tweets. And that's something we call a thread. And that's the topic I'm going to talk about a bit today and give you some examples. So this is just a thread. It's nothing more than a series of connected tweets. And you can write the first tweet and the second tweet, and it's all just pluses until you reach the end. And then you can publish it all at once. That's a thread. This is a nice example, I think, a very popular example of a popular science thread. And what you see, first of all, is that you have a sort of a thread counter. So it numbers the tweets from 1 till the end. What you can also see is that it has a lot of extra besides just words. It has nice images, it has URLs with images, and it has polls, because you can also use polls on Twitter. And it does some extra thing with spacing, so it looks a bit nicer than a regular tweet. If you're interested, by the way, in this particular topic, the question was, why do your hands become so wrinkly when you're in the bath? Well, it has a very complicated, of course, cause. But it's just pop science. Now the real science, so to say. This is a well-viewed and much shared short thread by Darren. I think it's your most popular thread, probably, approximately. So with 500,000 views, it's a lot. I really like this, the point he's making. It's just to point out that a thread doesn't have to be very long. This is very short. It's just 10 tweets with 750 characters each, 120 words in total. So it's a very short abstract, actually, but still a lot of views and a lot of reactions too. So this has just 2 core tweets, which I'm showing here, and then the remaining tweets all have URLs and to blogs and literature. We have a sort of a king, I would say, of medical threads. That is Professor Darrell Francis. And he has all kinds of very long threads with all kinds of stuff in it. I sometimes don't have the medical knowledge nor the interest to read them all. But this guy is also very successful in doing this threading. So another one by Tim Morris, which is a very different one. This is one actually to give his own point of view about intention to treat. It's a bit longer than Darren's. It's 22 tweets, 200 characters per tweet, 700 words in total, so it becomes a bit longer than an abstract, so to say. And the nice thing, I think, of this thread, which makes it a bit different than the one we saw from Darren, is it has a lot of graphics and jokes and hashtags, and also has actually a sort of a personal story to it. So you can actually include, I think, personal stories to make it more, maybe more interesting. So another very successful thread by Cecile, just about the area under the RC curve. 222 characters per tweet, 650 words in total, and again, lots of impressions, almost 280,000. Lots of graphics that she made and put online. And actually this resulted for her in an invited article to write about the area on the curve and her view on that. And she gained 900 followers just by this thread. Then there are also book clubs, especially in the epidemiology groups, Epi-Twitter. And this is a thread by Ellie Murray, which is just 7 tweets long, again with a lot of graphics and GIFs and hashtags. But this was just the first of 11 threads combined to discuss the whole book of Why, the book by the recent book by Judeo Pearl. This is of a whole different category, but also a nice thread, I think, which I used for building my website. So it's 27 tweets, a very nice series of videos, actually, that tell you how to use R to make a website. I did that, and using this thread, it was only an hour of work. So that was nice. This is where Darren already talked about a bit. It's a thread that was started by Andrew Althouse, 16 tweets, and actually resulted in 39 comments on PubPeer, and actually mentioning in Retraction Watch, it was all about that paper where the surgeons talked about post-hoc power. And currently, actually those objections made by 39 people are under review by the journal, and they're considering actually retracting the article just based on these. It all started with a threat, that's what I wanted to say. One of my own, that's what I sometimes do, is if I have a new article, we published an article in Statistics and Medicine not too long ago, and again, we got quite some impressions, so get a bit more information, a bit more exposure to your own work. And what we did here was actually write a non-technical thread. So, of course, statisticians often read Statistics in Medicine, but non-statisticians don't, so we try to actually explain the ideas from the paper in a non-technical thread. So now the question is, these are just some examples, what is the best way for making a science thread? And I guess that's the same as asking what's a good recipe for food. It's not very specific, but I try to answer it anyway. Using a very pseudo-scientific approach, just Twitter polls. So my first question was, how long can Twitter threads be? A lot of people, I guess, and I also feel like that, is that 8 or 10, 15, something like that is the max. Because if you make them longer, people will stop reading. Should you use pictures, videos, or GIFs? Well, if you ask people, they often say a few, jokes, also a few, polls, a few, links, a few, quotes, a few. And tweets that individual message, well, how long they are, that doesn't really matter. So the point is, of course, it's all a few. Because, of course, communication is a balancing act. There's no typical recipe, and I hope I've showed you that very different looking threads can actually be very successful. And not all threads are successful. This is one of mine. It got 0 likes, 0 retweets. And these are some good threads if you want to look at more. And that's what I want to say about threads.
Hello, everyone. Thanks very much for coming here. My name is Altea Lorenzo, and I'm a statistician, but I'm also a Twitter addict. So I'm delighted actually to be here today to talk about a topic that I really care about. That is diversity and inclusion in the stats Twitter community. And I'm very grateful to be invited to talk about. And this is not about getting more followers or not about getting more likes on your tweet, but about being more diverse and more inclusive in what we do in the community. And I want to start by highlighting the importance of pairing both diversity and inclusion within the work that we do throughout our stats work, but also on Twitter to try and be diverse and follow or be followed by people from different backgrounds, but also to try and be inclusive in making these different backgrounds join together, like we can see in this jigsaw. And it was great to hear our president, Deborah Asby, yesterday at the welcome reception, encouraging us all to be particularly diverse and inclusive in the way we behave at this conference and how we should try and aim to talk to people from other backgrounds, but not only in terms of statistical specialization, but also in general, different backgrounds. So yeah, I think that's very important, and I'll go even a bit further by saying that it will be great to do this also on Twitter. When I'm talking about diversity and inclusion, I'm talking about these terms in their wider sense, and I'm aiming to be inclusive in terms of gender, race, disability and impairment, sexual orientation and gender identity, but also across levels of seniority and across different languages and countries. And all of this to become conscious of our own unconscious biases and to try and limit them or counterbalance them, as well as counteract the effects of potential algorithm bias that are widely discussed online and on Twitter in particular, like this example where Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez from the US argues that math algorithms are essentially racist and potentially gender bias as well. So it's just trying to be conscious that we are perhaps making these biases when we are tweeting. And I'll start by asking myself, do I particularly feel included in the stats Twitter community? And I would say I often do, and I find people very welcoming, but also as a female, non-British, Spanish, not so young, early career researcher, sometimes I feel very little, and not just on this massive stage, but also on Twitter. And I try to bring my voice up and try to talk about things, but I find it difficult to sometimes express myself. I don't feel big enough to perhaps contribute to discussions by senior researchers, and that's why I make a big effort on making others feel included in the tweets that I post. But within the stats Twitterverse, I find particularly inclusive communities such as r/stats and EpiTwitter that make me feel even a bit more welcome and make me feel better. And I want to go through this too in particular. And you might all be well aware of r/stats, which is a community of active R software developers and users. And I would argue that this is the most inclusive community of scientists on Twitter. They go from creating all sorts of codes of conduct on diversity and inclusion to having all sorts of groups incorporating from our Leids Global, which is a massive group now with more than 140 groups worldwide, to Latinar for our ladies in Latin America, and their main representatives like Hadley Whitcomb, the chief scientist at our studio, are really very active and very, very inclusive, and they try to make everyone welcome in their community. And also Daniel Navarro and Mara Averick, who are very active users of Twitter, are fantastic at this. So it's really an incredibly welcoming community. And I think this brilliant illustration by Alison Horst represents that very well, represents that spirit very well. But also there are other communities like EpiTwitter, which is a rapidly growing community on Twitter. You will have heard of Ellie Murray, as my colleagues have also mentioned in their talks. And she's incredibly engaging, and she's really good at incorporating work from young career researchers, people from other backgrounds in her tweets. So she's really great at making you feel included. And if you ever DM her or try and tweet her, she's always there ready to reply and help you. But there are also big accounts like Black Epi Matters trying to represent minorities, and also great initiatives like this one by Dr. Swanita Sally Jefferson on trying to encourage people to speak to students from minorities, underrepresented minorities, and make a change. And I think this is a fantastic thing that this community has. And although both Darren and Maarten are too humble for me to include them in here, I would also like to include them because, I mean, they are very, very experienced researchers with lots of followers, and they've invited me, who I'm a very early career researcher with very few followers, and I'm giving this talk today. So they've been really fantastic at being engaging on Twitter in general, and I've always felt very, very included in their Twitter world, and yeah, they are absolutely fantastic at doing that. So thank you for that. Going back to my own personal experience, even by trying to be inclusive, when I look at my numbers, I'm really failing at it. And so I noticed by using this tool, Proportional, that most of the people that I follow, that follow me and that I retweet tweets from are men. And women are not that, I don't really represent a majority of women, and definitely I do very badly on the non-binary front, although that might be motivated by the fact that this tool might not be as good as capturing that sort of minorities, given the brief descriptions that you give on Twitter on your profiles, but it's still very relevant that I'm doing so badly, even trying actively. And things don't get better when you focus on country or languages. So even if I'm a native Spanish speaker, I mostly interact with British and American, probably English speakers. So I'm not doing very well at that, and that's certainly something that I plan to address, and perhaps use more of my Spanish or combine both languages. It's really tricky to decide how to do it, but I certainly think it's important to make Twitter a more open place where all languages can be represented. In terms of how I try to be more inclusive, even if I fail, I try to look for profiles that widely distribute or widely represent these minorities or other people that I don't feel are so highly represented on Twitter. And I think this fantastic Twitter list by Data Science Rene is a great example of this. It has more than nearly 2,000 members, and they are all data scientists and data scientists are statisticians, mostly female or gender minorities, and it will give you a sense of how many people are out there that are not really being perhaps not as vocal as other areas of statistics, but they are there, and I will invite you to explore it and to perhaps follow some of this. And this is something that we're trying to do at YSS as well, which is I'm part of this group, the Young Statistician section of the RSS, where we try on our Twitter to represent as much as possible of the UK stats community, but also have tried during March, during the International Women's Day, we tried to give a highlight of women in other departments and societies across the world, which was very successful, and it gave us some hope that there's definitely lots of work being done in this topic around the world, and that we are more widely represented than we thought. So it's a great idea, and it's a great effort that we will continue doing. But there are also, apart from individuals, there are lots of women in science profiles that I will invite you to follow or to explore, like 500 women scientists or women in statistics, where they do this on a daily basis. They try and encourage women in stats or in other areas of STEM to highlight their work. So it's a great way to be a bit more inclusive. But yeah, going back to this idea that I am trying to be more inclusive and trying to actively follow more females, for instance, and I still get, when I look at my statistics, that I'm much more represented by, I'm much more following men than females, then I wonder if it just made me recall this paper by Hinsley et al. On how men ask more questions at a scientific conference. And I wonder if it's also the case on Twitter. If men are more active on Twitter, and that's why I'm following more men. And actually, it's funny to see that there's more men in this audience, I will say today as well. So perhaps it is true, but I mean, it's not a problem I've had on Twitter. I've had very nice interactions with men throughout, but there seems to be a pattern, and it's actually gained this sort of mansplainers on Twitter, the hashtag reply guys. And if you look for it on Twitter, you will find that there's a lot of moan from women on how there's these guys that comment on anything that you say, that have lots to argue about the way you express a concept, or you try to explain your argument. So it's quite interesting that this is also happening on Twitter, and this ironic blog post talks about how they try and dominate. These sort of guys are always trying to put a note on your tweets and trying to dominate Twitter. So perhaps this is what is driving my following to be mostly male-dominated, but I don't really know. It's not something I've looked into the numbers yet, but I will be interested, and I would like to hear your views on this. But again, I was just talking about gender throughout, but I want to focus on other things like race as well. I think there are very small efforts we can make to make our Twitter experience more inclusive in terms of race. So there's something as silly as considering different tones of skin in our emojis when we post a tweet with emojis that will perhaps make others feel more represented in our tweets. And I particularly love this tweet by Diana Klatt, an American epidemiologist, on criticizing this biased portrait of women in science by UNESCO in last February. They were doing this to celebrate, apparently, the diversity of women in science, women and girls in science. And it was a real shame that they failed to represent the real diversity of our fields. And they went for a straightly white skin, white lab wearing scientists. So this created a big viral set of responses on Twitter about how that wasn't representative. And I think Diana Klatt really argued this point very well. And I think we all can break these stereotypes, can try it with our Twitter. to break these stereotypes, and it's important that we do. And in terms of giving more visibility to people from underrepresented minorities, the American Statistical Society and other associations that are doing a great job at doing this and frequently highlight the work or the background of historical minority statisticians and mathematicians in general. And hashtags like mathematically gifted and black are a proof of this and are very successful on Twitter. And also other hashtags more generic, like visible woman or black in AI and artificial intelligence are widely used throughout Twitter, and I will encourage you to use them or to explore them to see what other views are expressed out there. In terms of disability and impairment, apologies for the mistake there. There are ways that we can make our tweets more inclusive as well. I have actually tried to do this today on my tweets about this talk on TweetDeck, and it didn't quite work, but if you try on Twitter directly, it should work, and it's basically just adding a description to your images on Twitter for blind users. And just with that simple step, you are making more people aware of your tweets. They will fully enjoy the depth of your tweet if the picture is adding something to the actual tweet content. So I think it's important to give these small steps. I will actually be very interested in hearing from other ways in which we can make our tweets more open and accessible for disabled and impaired people. Actually, I don't have much knowledge on the topic, but I found this way to try and do it quite interesting and very useful. But again, it's just not about gender, race, or disability, but also about sexual orientation and gender identity. And accounts like Pride in STEM and Researchers Code that support trans women in STEM are great at giving visibility and promoting inclusive behaviors. And also private initiatives like Amy Barrett here, asking for people from these underrepresented minorities to give a short bio and talk about their work out there, to just be vocal about it. I just think these are great ways to make of Twitter a more inclusive world. But as an early career statistician, I'm very mindful of including different levels of seniority within my tweets, within my followees and followers. And this is something that we really strive to do at the YSS section as well. So we try with hashtags like YSS Takeover, YSS Reporter. We try to encourage other young statisticians to report about their work, about their experiences in conferences, and you are all very welcome to do this during this conference. But also we do this initiative by which we record small videos of poster presenters during the conference, and we post them on our account, which potentially has more followers than some of these researchers. And we invite people to come and see their posters that sometimes are forgotten in these big conferences. So yes, please let us know if you are interested in taking part of this, because we are really happy to feature any work by any of you. And also, finally, as an immigrant in Brexit Britain, I didn't want to finish this talk without talking about the importance of featuring other languages and countries in Twitter, in our Twitter experiences, in our Twitter accounts. And I think this thesis is very interesting. I haven't had the time to go through it, but I love this idea that by including more languages and more followers from more countries in our Twitters, we might be building bridges across countries within our stats community as well. So I will really encourage you to do that if you are bilingual, to try and use both languages, and this is something that I will definitely try and do myself. But yeah, overall, these are my general thoughts on the topic. I will be really happy to hear your comments and suggestions. either now or in the future on my account, Altea Lorenzo. Thanks very much. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Altea. Thank you, Maarten. We're also going to be joined by Deirdre Toer, who's very kindly agreed to join the panel for any questions. She's a very active blogger and science communicator, and she stepped into the breach here after we had a few people who couldn't actually make it in the end. We've got a good bit of time for questions, and we're happy to take those now. I'd ask that maybe for the first few questions, if we could kind of leave it for the earlier career people to get their questions in first. Maybe if you're a little further along in your career, maybe hold off for a minute and then maybe ask your questions after. If that'd be okay with everybody, we'd appreciate that. And so please, anything you have to ask, we're happy to talk. We've got about 15 minutes. And again, I know that myself and everyone else is happy to chit chat afterwards or whatever, so feel free to grab one of us or get to us on Twitter if you have any questions. So thank you.
Don't all rush to the mic. Yes.
Can I ask a question? I've already got the mic. So you talk about all of the diversity and making sure that you're following this group of people and everything, but a lot of the examples that are shown earlier on were of white men that are the professors in statistics. So do you feel hopeful that things will change more as diversity goes through and we end up with more diverse professors, that then the people to follow will be more diverse, or do you think there's people there and they're just being ignored at the minute, and how do we do things?
Who wants to tackle this one first?
I'll start. It's a twofold issue. It's one of who's active on Twitter, and I think we do see it by the stats. Twitter is male-dominated, and that's essentially the population you're sampling from. Then there's the issue of kind of the gender imbalance as you progress through the career ranks. So it's kind of a twofold issue. You can make conscious decisions on Twitter about who to follow. After Storm Deirdre last year, I decided I was going to follow lots of Deirdres all over the world. And actually, you can pick a niche name and follow it, like search for them. And you can check and you go, actually, I don't like what they're saying. It's a good way to get a kind of a sample from across the world. Just go, I'll pick a name. I'll just start typing them in and see who I follow. You can always unfollow them pretty quickly if you don't like what they're saying. But I've ended up following a lot of really interesting people from very diverse backgrounds by doing that, by picking a name and following it.
No, you go.
I think one of the issues is I think we have kind of this double-edged issue where, you know, on the one hand, we want to encourage more people to participate. We know that there are a lot of people on Twitter, we kind of say lurking, and they're watching and they're learning, and that's fantastic. But we also, I think that it really takes off when you're able to interact with people and kind of get that confidence from interacting with people and whatnot. But like I said in the talk, we want to encourage everyone to participate so we get a diversity of opinions, so we make sure that we have the absolute best people, and there's no way to do that if we're cutting some people out. But at the same time, I can't stand up here and stomp my feet and say, you need to participate, because again, I think it's until we find a way to mitigate those risks, it's impossible. We have a lot of very senior female statisticians who are on Twitter, who are active on Twitter, and but I do think you're right that it's the conversations tend to be dominated by the men, but I think that barrier is there, and it's hard to say get involved, because if you do, there's this chance that you're going to have to put up with this nonsense, and the little bits of that nonsense I've had to put up with were impactful. It's not fun to deal with, and that's at the very the kind of lowest level. So I think it's hopefully is one of those things where time will help, but we also have to be very proactive. And I think one of the main things, that people are getting right is just talking about it. And so maybe 5 years ago that this wouldn't have been on everyone's mind, that this is actually an important thing in and of itself. It's not a side item, it's a core item to how we grow these communities and make them valuable, just to keep bringing these issues up. And as more people kind of hear about it and become convinced, oh yeah, that is important, we shouldn't have people who have to be attacked or harassed or whatever just because they're trying to have an opinion on Twitter. And then maybe all of us can, you know, over time kind of continue to push those people to the side and shut them up.
Slightly different, but what would you say in the sense of your tweets aren't peer reviewed or anything, and you could just spout off a load of nonsense?
Sure.
So what would you say in terms of making sure there is accountability there?
Well, I think, and I'm sure Maarten will have opinion, well, probably everyone. I think one, there's accountability there because people are doing this out in the open and in public. And I think, you know, this issue of peer review, I used to think peer review was a thing that happened consistently and was of high quality and improved things. I don't think that anymore whatsoever. So I don't particularly find it to be a particularly compelling issue. I think if people are out there sharing their opinions openly, then those opinions can be critiqued and they can be pushed back on and whatnot. And I think that's better than a lot of the way we treat other forms of science communication, where all that stuff is done behind closed doors and very much not in the open, and not all the messages are out there and shared. So for me, I think that, you know, if I say, like I've said incorrect things on Twitter before, and it's usually Richard Morey who comes in and corrects me and explains to me how I've got it wrong, and I'm appreciative of that, and I might blush a bit, but it gets corrected. And at the same time, I think there are people, like I said, who very intentionally use, you know, kind of science-ism and statistics speak to kind of befuddle people. But again, if that's out there, we can push back on that. So I think I tend to be more of a free-for-all person. By all means, make your own decisions, throw it out there, and you'll get the response you'll get.
Yeah, I agree. I really like the fact that Twitter gives you the opportunity to interact also with people, something you don't get from peer review, for example. And you do get pushback. I've been wrong on Twitter more than once, and people have pointed this out, and I'm actually very grateful for that. Yeah, I've been correct sometimes too, by the way, but not only wrong.
A few times.
Few times. Yeah.
Pretty much sums it up for me.
Jamie Sargent from University of Manchester. Thanks to the panel for sharing your wisdom both in the room today, and I think we all benefit from the work you do online as well. So Darren said we're not going to hold hands and sing Kumbaya, but some of us might feel the need for some support as well. So for those of us that are more lurkers than interactors, how do you manage your Twitter? Do you have to plan? Because I guess a lot of us feel we have full inboxes and more tasks than we can achieve as applied statisticians. How do you make the time for Twitter and make the most of it?
For me, I look at it like in terms of, you know, the marginal benefit. I have no doubt that I waste time on Twitter that could be spent doing other things. And there's no doubt that writing a blog post is time that could be spent working on a published paper. And I'm fortunate enough to be in a position where I'm in a pretty secure job at this point. After 10 years in academia, I kind of finally crossed that threshold now. And so there's not as much pressure anymore to make sure that you're maximizing your output and all the rest of it. So there's definitely time that I spend on Twitter that, the counterfactual is, well, if I could carve that time out and apply it to other things, I'd probably be better off. But I also find that I save so much time and other stuff just through the things I talked about, finding reviewers, asking a question, that saves me so much time when there are experts, messaging someone about an idea and getting their reply, that it's the net benefit at the end of the day that I hope I can fall back on and say, okay, this isn't a total waste. This isn't, this is overall a good thing. That said, I think you do, though, need to be proactive about. So I do try to turn it off, especially on days after I've written something and shared it. I do try to put Twitter away very specifically on those days. I've spent a couple years on one of the old candy bar phones very intentionally so I wouldn't have Twitter on my phone, which I thought was a really good thing. And I've digressed on that a bit, and I might go back to that because I thought just not having it in my pocket all the time is quite good. It is a real issue. Like it can be wasteful, and to say to find the time, but it's just I kind of interact with it very passively. take a look, see something interesting, retweet, most of that stuff, and the real kind of time, effort into it is pretty concentrated kind of spurts, I think.
Yeah, so you're talking to somebody here who has 4 Twitter accounts on her phone. That's perhaps excessive compared to many people. They do all serve different purposes. For creating tweets, I'm a fan of TweetDeck for scheduling them. So for example, if you're planning a talk and you want to say, I want to have all the tweets out, so I can't rely on somebody being in the front to live tweet what I'm doing without the back of people's heads obscuring half of my slides. So if you are live tweeting something, you do kind of need to bite the bullet and come up near the front so you don't have the back of somebody's head in any photos. I manage Twitter in kind of very distinct time periods. So during my commute, that's a great time if you commute by public transport. Have a read through Twitter, gets you kind of into the day, over coffee, that type of thing. It's when I would not want to be focusing carefully on something else, and then I'll bookmark it if it's an interesting technical topic that I might actually want to come back to with kind of more of an academic brain and gear. So the use of bookmarks within Twitter now to be able to kind of come back to things easily. So used to essentially have to favorite things to bookmark them. And these were stuff that I didn't necessarily want to favorite, because I was like, I'm not sure if I agree with it, but I did want to return to it. So I'm a big fan of that. I've been on Twitter more than 10 years now. I was a lurker from, I'm trying to think, from like 2009 to probably 2014, 15-ish. So I was a lurker for many years. And you can gently get into it. If you are the sort of person who is afraid of getting involved in Twitter, starting off by live tweeting a stream of things at a conference where you're kind of saying, this is what somebody else is saying. It's kind of a nice way to break that ice, that you can get some really nice interactions without it feeling like it's on you and you're going to have a horrible Twitter storm and slightly disgusting DMs, which unfortunately is a thing.
I would like to add to all of that it will be important to consider these Twitter activities as important as other professional networking. And in fact, you get to learn about many things, like pieces of software that come out and are straight away on Twitter, or pieces of work, papers that are archived directly before being published, and you can find many of those on Twitter. So there's certainly a value on it that I don't think should be just left to your time at home when you are not doing anything. I think a part of our work, our professional work, could be easily dedicated to this, and it's not necessarily time wasted. And I'm probably more of a lurker myself than an active Twitter, but I still find it very, very useful to go there and try and interact. And every little step that I give, I feel particularly proud of, and I feel like I'm getting there. So I don't know, I will tell you to persevere and come to our workshop tomorrow, our tutorial on the practicals of it, and hopefully that will give you more further motivation to continue that.
Yeah, what should I add? There's already so much said. Yeah, but when do I tweet? Indeed, I also go by train to my work. I must admit, I probably have tweeted too much, and it costed me one paper probably. But I try to lower it down. It helps. I have young children, so I wake up in the night, and sometimes I do a tweet then. So it's a bit in between. I don't schedule in my agenda an hour of Twitter a day or something. So it's I take the opportunity, so to say.
We've got time for one more if there's one question.
Nigel Marriott, I've become active on Twitter over the last couple of years, and one of the things I have to make a decision about is when I want to put some thoughts out. Do I do a blog or do I do a tweet thread? What guideline would you give people on making that decision?
Whether to tweet or to blog about it? Yeah.
Or perhaps even publish a paper?
Yeah, no, fair enough. Myself, I like the blogging because, you know, most scientists, whether they admit it or not, are professional writers, and so, you know, going through the process of writing in a different kind of format than you normally do, I think is good for exercising those muscles. And so I tend to veer towards blogging more than just doing everything on Twitter. But that said, if it's, you know, we start to talk about, you know, what engagement you can see, I really kind of was short selling the kind of ability to reach people through the tweet threads. I don't really do that many of them, just maybe a small handful, but there's no denying the fact that they can get quite a bit of attention, and people do appreciate them. And not just, like, we see this not just in statistics, like there's all kinds of accounts from all kinds of different areas of science and beyond, where you just get these experts tweeting this stuff that, you know, only they really understand. And, you know, it's just fascinating to watch. You know, at the end of the day, using Twitter to do that stuff probably gets you a pretty similar reach in some respects and not nearly as much time spent. I think blog posting, if you're really trying to write well and think about what you're doing, I think it does take quite a bit more time, and it kind of sits in the brain a little bit longer, kind of dislodging other stuff you might want to think about, whereas sometimes Twitter is I can just get it out of my system, I can get it off my chest, and then sometimes things turn into blog posts after that. I don't know. I think it's maybe how the mood strikes you kind of a question in some respects. But I certainly have undersold the tweets in favor of the blogging, and I think that's a bit of a mistake.
One of my questions would be, why not both? And then the other comment would be horses for courses. It depends what you want to write about and how much level of detail you want to go into, and whether or not you want to have any mathematics in it. Twitter doesn't do maths well, or really at all. So if you were trying to do a tweet and you're going, well, I need to include some maths, therefore I need to have a picture of it. Now I can't do alt text of that very easily. So, and that's the thing, it's really, if you are not, unless you're in a live tweeting situation, there is no excuse for you not to put in alternative, like the expanded text describing photographs. Like, unless you're really trying to get a tweet every 10 to 30 seconds, keeping up with a talk or something like that, you have time to put in the description of what that photograph says. It's just being nice. Because that's the one thing that we should all remember on Twitter is it's a public forum, and like politeness doesn't cost anything, and starting off with that being your base thing, and politeness and courtesy, and thinking about, actually, am I going out of my way to be antagonistic towards people unnecessarily? And antagonistic can be in multiple ways, in terms of just pushing a viewpoint that is exclusionary of others for no need. So that's the big thing, for no need, is a big thing to think about, to say, should I just put this phone down? Or should I just walk away from the keyboard and maybe take 5 minutes and see what I still want to say that afterwards? Because the instantness of tweeting can cause problems that blog posts you tend to mull over a bit longer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I will agree with that. Yeah, I will definitely go for both, and definitely use Twitter to promote the blogs. If you don't really want to build a thread or whatever, you can just promote them through Twitter, and that can be a very active way to get comments as well, which blog posts sometimes get forgotten. They're read but not necessarily commented on, whereas Twitter you get into an active discussion. So.
All right, everyone, thank you very much for coming. This was really enjoyable for us. And again, thank you very much, and we'll see you around, and feel free to grab us and ask any questions or anything else. All right, thank you.